What's up, everybody? I'm Jason, and welcome back to the vlog. This is the vlog for Friday, the 10th of December, 2021, and I know I missed last week. I was going to do a vlog last week, and then, well, I spent all day working on the video that's coming out next week, which turned out to be a bit more work than I had intended, or expected, I guess is the way to put it, and I just didn't have the energy to do a vlog. Last week, though, was a pretty busy week in terms of Canon camera stuff, at least. Firmware version 1.5 for the R5 and R6 dropped. The actual information seems to be, or the actual update seems to be slightly different than what the Canon rumors, what we should expect was saying, or at least possibly what I said with respect to what features were coming to what cameras. So that was the big update. Then this week, of course, DXOMark has tested the R3 and has it listed as the best performing low light camera that they have tested to date, full frame at least. So that's pretty impressive. Of course, I didn't really expect it not to be a thing. The R3, looking at the early test results, at least from DXOMark, pretty solid dynamic range for full frame, basically slightly better than the R5, and the R5 is pretty much up there class leading, if you will. So that's pretty good news, at least, you know, if you're a Canon person. And then now the coupled with having the best low light performance of any full frame camera tested to date, that's pretty solid numbers. Of course, I keep saying Canon is not the, that's a good way to put it. Canon is not the perennial underdog or perpetual underdog crap manufacturer that people still want to try and pretend that they are. Their sensors are very much on point, at least the ones they care about, the full frame ones. The crop ones, maybe not so much. But where they're clearly putting the effort and time into, which is in the full frame cameras, their modern sensor designs are definitely not garbage. And I didn't really expect to see that happen with the R3. I didn't expect to see them go backwards. I think Canon spent long enough being the laughing stock of the industry 6, 7, 8 years ago, and they know what they need to do. So that's the R3 being low light performer, pretty. I won't say impressive, but it's good news, I guess, if you're a Canon shooter. As I said, the other major thing that happened, and this is now a week old, is that Canon has released the firmware 1.5 for the R5 and R6. As far as I'm concerned, there's not a tremendous amount to talk about. There's 13 bullet points that Canon has released in the firmware update. The important ones, as far as I'm concerned, are winter sports people face detection or whatever. So people with helmets and goggles for, winter sports activities. I suspect that will carry over to lots of other things where people wear helmets and goggles, like maybe paintball. Vehicle detection AF is now a thing. Obviously, that came in the R3. The R3 has that. The R5 and R6 have it. Canon does say that the system is designed to detect cars and motorcycles in motorsports contexts and may not work with ordinary passenger cars. When I put the firmware on, I ran outside and started pointing it at whatever random cars I could find on the street, and it detected all the cars just fine, and these were regular passenger cars and SUVs. There's also a detailed detection mode where the camera, and I think this is going to be more relevant for motorcycles and open wheel race cars or open cockpit race cars, is that when the camera detects a helmet in the car, it will then focus on the helmet, or on the motorcycle, so it'll focus on that, as opposed to just tracking the whole vehicle as a whole, which is obviously, the person driving the car is probably the focus of what, you want to have the camera focusing on. So that makes sense. So they've added some other improvements to face detection to deal with hair over the eyes and shadows on the face, which is obviously good. They've also... Oh, they've got a new manual white balance feature that's available straight through the custom or through the quick control menu on the back of the camera. You hit Q, you go white balance. You set custom white balance. You point the camera at something that's white or neutral gray. You hit the white balance or you hit the set or whatever it is, and the camera will automatically tune to that white balance. So it's way faster than the previous way of doing white balance, custom white balances, where you had to take a picture of the thing that you wanted to use as your white balance reference and then go into white balance and do that. So that's definitely a positive. The rest of the issues essentially or the rest of the log notes are essentially fixes for minor bugs and issues that I'm not going to go into here because, well, quite honestly, they're really just not that important. I mean, they're important if it affects you. They're important that Canon's fixing it, but they're not important enough to me to spend a lot of time talking about. The big thing that I wanted to talk about today is this. I finally got my RF 100 to 500, and so I wanted to talk about my first impressions about that 100 to 500. So I ordered it basically just as Canon announced that it was coming off of the supply shortage production constraint list. So hoping that it would, be available fairly quickly. I mean, not that I was in a huge rush, but I am going to Yellowstone in the spring next year, and I'd like to have the lens, wanted to have the lens before I did that because I didn't want to rent one. I didn't want to rent a 600 f4 or something like that again. I'd rather have just one nice light compact zoom that's functional for me. So it did take over a month for me to get the lens. I ordered it on November 4th. I received it today when I'm recording this on the 8th of December. So I'm going to say, even though Canon is saying that the lens is now no longer supply constrained, I'm going to say that this is probably going to be the case for at least another month or two at best, or at a minimum, that if you're ordering the lens now, expect to wait 4 weeks before you get it. Now, hopefully, with the lens no longer being on the supply shortage production constraints list, that it will, that will shorten down to them being in stock somewhere, in stock, regularly ready, available to ship when you order it going forward. But at the moment, I'm expecting there to still be some supply constraints, or at least I'm expecting that even though production may be at regular expected levels, that there's still going to be some time for the supply chain to catch up and the everything to sort of fall into place. So expect, at least for the next month or two, maybe 3, maybe a bit longer, that if you're ordering a 100 to 500, it's probably going to be a month wait. It may be getting, or that may start getting better, but don't expect to see it, or I'm not expecting to see it on as an in-stock item on retailer shelves in the near or immediate future. So, as I said, I wanted to talk about my first impressions of the lens, and so let's just dive right into talking about that. The first thing that I noticed is that it feels lighter. Feels lighter than my 100 to 400, and in fact, not having, I didn't have the specs when I pulled it out of the box, but going and looking at the specs on the digital picture where I put them next to each other because it was just the quickest way for me to do it, the lens is in fact 14% lighter, which I'm rather impressed by, I guess. So for us Americans, it's 48.2 ounces instead of 56.1 ounces. For everybody else in the world, it's 1.365 kilograms versus 1.59 kilograms, which is pretty impressive, actually, in my opinion. It's that it's basically that much lighter for not actually, it's 100 millimeter longer focal length. The physical lens is actually bigger. Of course, this is something I've talked about with basically all mirrorless lenses, is if you're talking about a long focal length mirrorless lens. So everybody gets, well, I won't say everybody, but a lot of people got caught up with this idea that because the sensor was closer to the lens mount, it would make all lenses smaller and lighter and more compact and amazing. And the reality is that kind of applies, or that does apply to short focal length lenses. So if you have 24 millimeters or 50 millimeters, 50 millimeter lens on a regular camera with a roughly 50 millimeter register distance, still has to be basically a retrofocal design. It's still like the optical center of the lens simply can't be 50 millimeters from the image sensor. The same thing, well, technically the same thing still kind of applies to mirrorless cameras, because you're with a 20 millimeter, but the lenses can be less of a retrofocal design. They can be more symmetric. It makes shorter lenses easier design and better optically. But when you start talking about like 100 millimeter lens or 200 millimeter lens or 500 millimeter lens, so much of the focal length, the focal length is so much longer than the register distance that whether the register is 20 millimeters or 50 millimeters, it just doesn't really matter that much to the overall size of the lens. And what ends up happening, and you can certainly see this in Sony's lenses, where their 70 to 200 f2.8 is longer than the 70 to 200 f2.8 A-mount lens that it replaced. You can sort of see this in some of Nikon's lenses. Canon, of course, with their 70 to 200s went sort of a completely different track, and they went with the idea of making the lens super compact instead of basically taking a EF size design and making it mirrorless. So that's a little bit different. But in the case of like the 100 to 500, the lens has to make up for the lost register distance essentially compared to the 100 to 400. So it's a little bit longer, but it's still lighter, which as far as I'm concerned is, a good thing. Canon has decided to make their lens hoods match the lens. So it's a white hood now instead of a black hood. Now, I've always had my hood wrapped in snow camo tape, just because, I don't know, I thought it looked good. Partly it helped sort of protect the lens hood from bumps and bangs and scratches, because it was a soft, reusable camo tape stuff. I kind of like the white hood that matches the lens. I kind of always thought it was a little weird to have a big black hood hang out off the front of the end of the lens, and considering that it's just paint, it never was that big of a deal for Canon to paint the hoods to match the camera. The hood is smaller. I did notice this is something I thought was interesting. The hood is smaller than the hood on the 100 to 400, or shorter, I should say. I haven't actually looked at the geometry or whatever, so it's entirely possible that it's also narrower or smaller in diameter, and therefore it could be shorter because it's covering the same angle of view. I didn't really pay much, or haven't really looked into that in any detail. One thing I did think was very, well, I won't say interesting. One thing that kind of caught me off guard is on the front of the lens hood, there's this black ring. And for whatever reason, I was really expecting that black ring to be rubberized, like a bump guard kind of thing. And it's not. It's just hard plastic. I'm kind of at a loss as to, why Canon, well, I guess it would have cost more to rubberize it, but for some reason it feel to me like I would have preferred it to be rubberized for some reason. Something else that I noticed, or something else about the lens hood, and I'm not sure if this is a pro or a con, is that Canon is no longer using a soft flocking material in the lens hood to control light reflections. They're using ridged plastic. So the whole front, or the whole interior of the hood, is hard, and it is making use of essentially a sawtooth pattern to reflect light that way and not back at the sensor. So again, slightly different design ethic or idea. I'm not sure if, like, I'm sure it makes the hood a little bit cheaper, but again, I'm not finding anything in the hood that screams Canon was cutting corners on the hood or cutting costs on the hood. And quite honestly, as much as the flocking soft material may be minutely better on the older hoods, it gets dirty. It's something that you have to be very careful to clean. I've found that mine like pick up dust, and with a hood that's all solid plastic, you can take a damp towel and wipe it out, and it's way easier as a maintenance point, which personally I'm fine with. If it does the job, you know, I'm not one of these people that's like so invested in the way it was that if something new does the job just as well and is easier to clean or easier to maintain or easier to produce or more robust, that I'm going to complain that they changed something just because, you know, it seems like, I mean, you certainly can look at it and go, well, it feels cheaper or whatever because it doesn't have the fabric. But having tried to clean dust and crap out of the fabric or the flocking or whatever you want to call it in Canon's old lens hoods, this should be much easier to deal with when it gets dusty or dirty or crap gets in it or whatever. So that's a positive in my opinion. The control ring, I don't particularly care for it. So this is, the control ring is back here by the camera. This is the focus ring. This is the zoom lock tension ring, and this is the zoom ring at the very front. And quite honestly, so this is a complaint that I have now. It applies to Canon and Nikon lenses with control rings. I like the idea of a control ring. The problem I have is they put the control rings all over the place. There's no consistency. And consistency helps breed muscle memory. And without having that muscle memory or actually having a control ring on every lens, which can be a potential problem, for example, if you're a Canon user and you want to shoot with DSLR lenses, you obviously have the control ring mount adapter. But like if you're a Nikon user and you're shooting still with DSLR lenses, they don't have a control ring on their F to Z adapters, so you don't have a control ring now. Which basically means that unless and until you completely transition to the new RF or Z mount lenses with control rings, you can't rely on the fact that there's a control ring on your camera or on your lens, which means you can't put something really important on the control ring because you go to shoot something and it might not be there. As I said, the other problem, and this is the problem that I run into with the RF 100 to 400, is that the control ring is at the back of the lens. It's on the front of the lens on my 24 to 70, and it moves around. And moving around isn't as big of a problem as not having it, but again, it doesn't let you build muscle memory, which is kind of harder, makes it harder to just work the system in general. The lens foot. So Canon changed the lens foot on the 100 to 500 from the incredibly phenomenal lens foot that was on the 100 to 400 Mark II. So the 100 to 400's lens foot was very much a derivative of the super telephoto primes. The entire mounting system, everything was internal. You could take the foot off, but you couldn't take the rotating collar off. And it was super smooth. It was an amazingly good lens foot. And probably I would say, short of a 400-2.8 or 600-4 or 500-4 or something like that, or 200 to 400-4, short of being one of those big white super telephoto lenses, the foot on the 100 to 400 Mark II was the best that you could get on a Canon camera. Now, on the 100 to 500, they have sort of gone back to the optional foot style that they were doing with like the 24 or the 70 to 200 f4s, or the removable foot styles that they were using on previous lens designs. Again, I think even the 100 to 400 Mark I would apply there. So my first observation of the foot is, I mean, it looks good on the lens, don't get me wrong. It's very smooth and well integrated and looks kind of aerodynamic. But taking it off the lens, I noticed a couple of things. So first of all, it felt kind of cheap and flimsy. Now, I don't think it is. I'm pretty sure there's a metal backbone, or it's all metal, so it's not like it's something that's going to just break and fall apart in that respect. But it's kind of, and also that comes kind of part and parcel with the hinge design, because it's sort of flopping all over the place, which just, I won't say it doesn't inspire confidence, but it's just the nature of having a hinged opening lens foot. The thing that I think maybe bothers me the most about the foot, and this is something that's going to, remain to be seen how it plays out in long-term use in the field, is that it appears, I mean, I don't know exactly what material it uses, but it appears to be using felt pads to rotate around the lens. So if I looked at, for example, the 70 to 200 f4L, first generation one, it has this kind of, well, I guess it uses a felt pad too. So maybe I should take that criticism back, because I've had that lens out in the field and that felt pad works reasonably well, although it does eventually mar the lens surface to a certain extent, depending on where and how you're using it. So that's something to be aware of in terms of, again, cleaning and maintaining your gear. So the foot is not, it's not using like low drag, ultra high molecular weight plastics or something like that. It is using felt pads. So, if dirt gets in there, it's not going to be a good day for the finish on your lens with the lens foot. The other complaint, I guess, that I have is that it doesn't rotate as smoothly as the foot on the 100 to 400, which I talked about briefly, but, it is a thing. And if you're used to using the lens on a tripod or on a monopod and you use that, I guess there's pros and cons to having something that's a little bit more draggy versus something that's silky smooth. Again, this is something that's going to have to play out in the long run. I think I'm going to just have to see how this plays out. Now, the positive from all of this is that taking the foot off the lens isn't really a big deal. And quite honestly, the lens is light enough that if you're not going to be putting it on a monopod or a tripod, you pretty much don't even need to have the foot on the lens. So it's maybe, this will be something interesting. So I know back when I first started talking about the 100 to 500 and whether I wanted it or not, one of my big complaints was that you couldn't put the teleconverter on it and have the lens zoom to 100. It has to be 300 millimeters or further for the teleconverter to mount. And I wasn't sure, I'm still not sure, I don't have the experience with it yet. I'm still not sure whether the extra 100 millimeters of focal range or zoom range compensates entirely for me wanting to put a teleconverter on it. Because after all, the other problem, or the other side of that is if I put a 1.4 teleconverter on it, I now have a 700 millimeter lens instead of a 500 millimeter lens. And that's a big big jump in focal length too, just even more so. But I think what will be interesting to see is, I've never been a huge take the foot off of or take the tripod collar off of my telephoto lenses in the past because it didn't really, they were heavy with or without it, and two, I was usually putting them on a tripod. But this actually is light enough that I might actually be using it handheld a lot more than I'm, envisioning at the moment. And handheld, I can save even more weight, about 5 ounces, I think it is. Well, maybe 6 or 7 with the lens plate on there. I could save even more weight by taking it off completely, and it's easy to take off and it's easy to put back on. And in fact, this is kind of the criticism that I could level against the foot on the 100 to 400 Mark II, which is because it's screw on to the the mount, and the way the screw works so it doesn't accidentally come undone. It's a real pain to take that off. So what I end up doing most of the time is, instead of taking the foot off, I will just rotate it if I'm going to shoot handheld and put it on the top, and I kind of can use it as a carry handle, but it gets it out of the way of the bottom of the lens. Whereas on this, it's unscrew this a little bit, pop it out, and then the whole thing comes apart and off. And with it off, you're even lighter because you're saving the weight of the tripod ring. So that's, clearly there's a pro and a con there in terms of which way you want to go with that. And it'll be interesting to see as time goes on where I end up with the foot. If I flip it around and use it as a handle, or if I just take it off when I know I'm going to be using the lens handheld for any length of time, or I don't have anything to mount it on. If I'm not carrying a tripod or a monopod, I can leave the foot in the bag. Now, I will say again, because of the felt pads and whatnot, that my recommendation would be that you wipe off, you do the machinist thing, and you wipe off the surface of the lens where the foot rides with your hand or a cloth or something before you put the felt pads back on, just to make sure that you keep everything there clean and smooth and you don't end up destroying the finish on your lens any more than you absolutely need to. So let's see, what else? It's got a floating image stabilization element, which is the thing now that pretty much I think everybody is doing. I like locked image stabilization elements because they don't make a lot of noise and they don't rattle and shake. Now, presumably, I'm going to say this because a company doesn't put image stable, like Canon, Nikon, Sony, it doesn't matter, Panasonic, any of these companies. They're not going to put a floating image stabilization system in their lenses if it's more prone to failure, or significantly more prone to failure, than a fixed one. So, and again, my 100 or my 70 to 200 f4, first generation one, its image stabilizing element is floating, so it doesn't lock into place when the lens is dismounted or turned off. The companies aren't going to do that if it's going to break lenses, because for the first year, at minimum, they are going to be paying for that break in warranty claims, because people are going to demand that they fix it because it just broke. And beyond that, they're going to have really pissed off customers who are complaining about the fact that their lens keeps breaking because the floating image stabilizer. So I'm not terribly concerned about the reliability or ruggedness of a floating element. Now, what bugs me about the floating element is that it makes noise. That if you're carrying the camera around and it's super quiet, or you're doing something with the camera or lens and it's super quiet, you can hear the element kind of rattling or thunking around. And okay, it only matters when it's quiet. It's not the end of the world again, but it does make noise, and that can be annoying. When you're, say, cleaning a lens in a quiet room or something like that, that you have to be at least aware of that to, you know, not go and freak out and think that the image stabilizer is broken. Something else. Let's see. Oh, so I've got 2 more points and then I'm done, and then that's it. One of them I wanted to talk about is balance. Now, balancing and balance testing a lens is not exactly the easiest thing to do, if you ask me, largely because I don't want to drop it. And even dropping it on something like a soft bed or something like that is, I'd prefer not to do that, even that. So I was never really paid a whole lot of attention to the balance of my lenses or cameras or anything, other than preferring them to be more weighted towards the camera, towards the back, towards me, than being really front heavy. Never really paid a whole lot of attention until Nikon decided to make a big deal out of their internal counterbalance crap or system or whatever you want to call it on the 100 to 400 Z-mount lens that they came out with. And, you know, I read the stuff, I looked at it, I kind of went, okay, it's a thing, you know, whatever. How big of a deal that's really going to end up being on that lens is, I'm going to just say, an open question. Now, I know some people are going to rave about how great it is, and probably they don't even own the lens yet. Other people are going to say it's overrated, blah, 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 whatever. But at a minimum, it got me thinking about balance and looking at the balance on the 100 to 500. So again, holding this up, my configuration, it's a gripped R5, it's the 100 to 500, and I have a lens plate on the bottom of the lens. Oh, and I have a L plate on the camera. And that's basically how I go about shooting with that, with these lenses, or with this lens. So in this configuration, balance on this lens and camera is somewhere around where the focus ring is. Now, I can't be, again, I'm not really thrilled, like I'm not going to go try and get this super accurate, because again, this is like first impressions. It balances around the focus ring. And I tried zooming out, zooming in, so 500 millimeters, 100 millimeters, and regardless of what I did, the balance was right around the focus ring. If it shifted, which I'm going to say it shifted a little bit when I was at 500 millimeters, the balance moved from maybe the back of the focus ring to the front of the focus ring. So while Nikon's out making noise about their inner balance system and how nobody else has it, which is technically true, nobody else, as far as I know, has an inner balance system on their lenses, the 100 to 500 basically doesn't shift its balance when you're zooming with it anyway. So this was something, as I said, this is something that I've never really paid an awful lot of attention to. I only started thinking about it when Nikon made a big deal about it on the 100 to 400 Z-mount lens. And that got me thinking about it with this one, because Canon didn't make any deal about balance or balance shifting or, you know, anything like that. So, you know, I guess one thing I could say is that Nikon drawing attention to it, I went and looked at it, and basically it seems like it's a non-starter or non-issue. The other thing that I kind of briefly want to touch on, and this is going to be super brief, is image quality. Looks good to me. I've only got like a dozen pictures shot on it so far. I mean, I literally just got it this afternoon. But in the shots that I've done, things are in focus. It focuses fine. The images are sharp. You can count the scales on little lizards and things like that. So I'm not complaining. I know some people probably will be less than thrilled, or are less than thrilled, about the 7.1 aperture. Doesn't bother me all that much, largely because with my 100 to 400, I almost always had a 1.4 teleconverter on it, which made it an f8. So if you're used to shooting there, that's kind of what you are used to shooting at, and you just deal with it. So otherwise, pretty solid lens as far as I can tell. First impressions, it's I definitely like that it's lighter. That's than the 100 to 400 that I've been using. That's definitely a plus in my book as far as I'm concerned. Tripod collar, remains to be seen just how good that is in the long run, but on the plus side, it is replaceable, so I guess if the felt pads or something wear out and you really need to replace it, you can just order a new one or from Canon or whatever and replace it. It's not that big of a deal, I guess. But otherwise, you know, pretty solid lens. Pretty much what I expected in terms of, you know, build, performance, etc. so far. If I do run into any real issues or anything that really annoys the crap out of me, other than, like I said, the 300 millimeter teleconverter mounting thing, I'll definitely be talking about that in a future vlog. So with all that said, I'm going to wrap this up here. If you found this video interesting or informative, please let me know by hitting that like button. If you aren't subscribed and this kind of thing seems like it might be your kind of thing, please consider subscribing. Remember, you can't forget to unsubscribe later if you don't remember to subscribe now. And if you've made it this... Oh, and if you know somebody who might find this interesting, please share it with them. It helps grow the channel, and obviously it may help them out as well. So if you've made it this far, thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.